5 additional pieces of evidence that it was Mathew Franklin Whittier, not Edgar Allan Poe, who was the real author of The Raven. These are added to the original video, which presented 10 pieces of evidence. These are going to require a somewhat more in-depth explanation. Still, we will keep it as brief as possible. Remember, as you watch the following, that anything which is asserted in these videos can be backed up by solid evidence. None of this is mere speculation. Number 11. If Mathew Franklin Whittier shared The Raven with Edgar Allan Poe in confidence, sometime in late 1842 or early 1843, so that Poe subsequently claimed the poem when it was published in 1845, there shouldn't be much precedence for Poe's authorship in his poetry up to this time. There are a few of Poe's poems which have isolated elements similar to The Raven, but nothing one could call a clear precursor. However, there are signs that a high percentage of Poe's poems were plagiarized from other authors. The consistent pattern that emerges is Poe's taste in plagiarism. He liked poems of a certain tone, whether the author was devoted to God or was an atheist. But this trait normally doesn't waft in the breeze. Poe's track record indicates that he stole from people like Mathew, who were deeply religious but were going through some dark time and hence expressed a dark mood. Around 1829, Poe is said to have written a letter to his publisher, Isaac Leah, concerning plans to have his compilation, Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems, published. In the course of that letter, he penned a brief poem concerning their plans. It was my choice or chance or curse to adopt the cause for better or worse, and with my worldly goods and wit and soul and body worship it. No person who truly loves and worships God would ever write of worshiping a scheme to get published with, quote, soul and body. Therefore, every poem that Poe published which expresses sincere love for God was plagiarized. One of these poems, Spirits of the Dead, published in 1827, suggests that the author was a spiritualist. Be silent in that solitude, which is not loneliness, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee. Be still. But another of his plagiarized poets seems to have been the sort of Christian who believes that people lie in the tomb awaiting the resurrection, as we see in The Sleeper, which was published in 1831. The lady sleeps. Oh, may her sleep, which is enduring, so be deep. Heaven have her in its sacred keep. This chamber changed for one more holy, this bed for one more melancholy. I pray to God that she may lie forever with unopened eye, while the pale sheeted ghosts go by. The same person could not possibly have written both poems. Hence, the logical conclusion is that Poe plagiarized every poem he published which expresses faith in God or in an afterlife. This includes The Raven, which describes Mathew's own crisis of faith, and which is signed as Blank Quarles in tribute to deeply religious poet Francis Quarles, whom we know Mathew admired. Number 12. In the early 1840s, Mathew Franklin Whittier was signing as Poins, a reference to a Shakespearean character, for his work which appeared in the Portland, Maine transcript. The first of these is a Gothic story entitled The Vision, a Legend of the Merrimack, published on December 2, 1842. It tells of a bridge tender who had a premonition of his own death. But although Mathew admits in his closing comments that he has embellished the story, he also tells us that it was based on a true account. Thus, it is not a fantasy story at all, but rather an expression of belief in occult phenomena. The events are set in the town of Rocks Village, Massachusetts, which was the hometown of Mathew's beloved late wife, Abby, for whom he had also written The Raven. This would have been written about the same time, probably in 1841, in the months after her death. The backstory is that he contrasts the Merrimack River as he experienced it while courting Abby, near her family home, with his experience of returning to the same scene after she had died. Like The Raven, therefore, it is an authentic expression of personal experience based on a true story, as opposed to Poe's work, which is typically imagined experience based on a fantasized situation. The vision is, arguably, as well written as any of Poe's horror stories. At the gangway stood the trumpeter, a ghastly counterpart of the helmsman. In his fleshless fingers an enormous trumpet was clenched, from which peal after peal in harsh and discordant succession was poured. On they come. But still the toll-gatherer is immovable, fast chained to his rocky seat. As he gazes in tongue-tied horror, the dark-covered bridge is gradually lighted with a blue, unnatural light, revealing a perfect likeness of himself, slowly turning the great key by which the ponderous timbers of the draw were steadily rising. Fearfully and long did the spell-tied man look upon the deliberate operations of his phantom self. When the sundered planks had risen to the proper altitude, the skeleton ship and her ghostly crew passed noiselessly through, and the shadowy key-turner commenced lowering the draw. Slowly the creaking timbers were settling down towards their accustomed level, when suddenly the unearthly operator paused. The key fell from his hands, and he leaned against the railing. The head turned slowly towards the toll-gatherer, revealing to his horrified gaze a complete facsimile of his own features. Only the livid paleness of death was enstamped upon them. As he looked, the mouth opened, and a torrent of blood poured from it. Gradually this horrible pantomime faded away, and as the figure finally disappeared, an unearthly wail rose from the phantom ship below. Her awful form was lighted for a moment with a radiance too vivid for the gaze, during which she sank gently beneath the eddying waters, which hissed and boiled with the contact. Number 13. From the fall of 1849 to mid-1852, Mathew wrote a travelogue for the Boston Weekly Museum under the signature of Quails. The column was claimed for an entertainer named Ocean Dodge, but this was a false rumor which Mathew played along with, and which the editor eventually confirmed in print. Nonetheless, there is abundant evidence that Mathew, not Dodge, was the real author. Mathew may have chosen this pseudonym because it resembled Quarles, but there is no direct tie-in to prove it. However, there is a direct connection between Quails and Edgar Allan Poe. Mathew, as Quails, would often stop by daguerreotype shops to look at the portraits. While he was doing so in Samuel Massery's shop in Providence, Rhode Island, he was scrutinizing the last portrait of Poe, and Massery must have believed him so much a fan that he offered to make him a copy. This portrait is called, by historians, the Ultima Thule. In the June 14, 1851 edition of the museum, Mathew writes of having received this portrait and proceeds to describe it in detail. His take on Poe appears to be that he believes Poe to have been a misguided and maligned genius. The following facts will show, to a certain extent, the great reason we have to feel proud of the possession of this really beautiful and striking picture. For a number of years previous to Poe's death, the literati of Gotham tried their utmost to induce him to sit for his likeness, but owing to the misanthropic views which this child of genius had unfortunately formed in his childhood, and which had grown with his strength, until he looked upon all mankind as little better than cannibals, having no emotions of friendship above selfishness, and ready at a moment's warning to take advantage of a brother's weakness, he could never be persuaded to sit for his picture, fearing that it might, at some future day, be used in some manner to his detriment. Indeed, hundreds of his most intimate acquaintances are under the impression, even to the present day, that he never sat for his picture. But some 3 weeks previous to his death, while returning from his last visit to Boston, he made a stop in the city of Providence for a number of days, and regardless of the entreaties of his friends, indulged to an almost unlimited extent his unconquerable appetite for strong drink, and while in this highly nervous state of mind, accidentally dropped into the Daguerrean gallery of Samuel Massery, and as he was highly delighted with the pictures placed on exhibition, he proposed, on the impulse of the moment, to try for experiment and see if his own likeness could be taken to look as well as those on the table. Without a moment's delay, and before he had time to change his mind, the offer was instantly and joyfully accepted, and the reflection of his peculiarly expressive features was soon transferred to a full-sized plate. Note that while making excuses for Poe based on his childhood, Mathew nonetheless hints that Poe was, in fact, ready at a moment's warning to take advantage of a brother's weakness. This is a direct reference to Poe having stolen the raven from him, and the way Mathew presents it indicates his own struggle to understand and forgive. This is precisely what we might expect, given his Quaker upbringing and strong religious principles, though judging by many of his works, there was a strong current of vengeance in Mathew's psyche which ran parallel with these beliefs. Mathew goes on to analyze Poe's head on the basis of phrenology, which assigns certain qualities of character to the various bumps on the skull. Of his forehead we hardly know what to write. We have seen higher ones, but so expressive a one never, and until we had seen this picture, we were always under the impression that Poe either must have been drunk or crazy when he wrote that flesh-crawling magnetism story, but a sigh at the shape of his head sets us all right. The organs of ideality are as prominent as two large robin's eggs would be, placed one on each side of an ordinary head. However, as Mathew closes the letter, in his final sentence he drops, as it were, his true assessment of Poe in code. Mr. Massery has the original daguerreotype in his gallery at Providence, and the public can see the, quote, counterfeit presentment of this most brilliant of American poets by giving friend Massery a call. Here, Mathew has used the term counterfeit presentment for the daguerreotype, as though it is casually tossed off, but Mathew never used any such terms casually. It means that Poe himself was a, quote, counterfeit presentment, and calling Poe this most brilliant of American poets is said tongue-in-cheek. Since his own brother was one of the premier poets of America, Mathew would never have dishonored him by putting Poe at the top. Therefore, this must be radical irony, so that he means the exact opposite. In fact, this was Mathew's long-time modus operandi, which we can see in an announcement he printed when he was only 14 years old, in the January 4, 1827 Berkshire American. Apparently, some clerk or clerks, not having the authority to do so, had criticized a point of spelling or grammar in Mathew's work for that paper. Mathew responds in full irony by sarcastically pretending to be grateful for the feedback. Permit me through your paper to acknowledge the high and unspeakable obligations I am laid under to the censors, the kind ones, for their kindness in discovering and correcting a grand mistake committed by me, which must have been willful and malicious or merely through ignorance. Now I deny that I was actuated by any ill will or malice towards any. It must, therefore, be mere ignorance, a defect of my education or intellect, and may come within the reach of pardon. And I have abundant reason to hope for forgiveness of my magnanimous censors, as they were so generous and discreet in the manner of correcting the error, so as to save me from public ridicule, not spreading the infamous news abroad and behind my back, but with all the politeness they were master of, came directly to me, and asked whether I had not committed a most violent outrage on an English word, by leaving out an A, or E, or some other letter which had a right, by the strictest rules of science, to have a standing among its fellows, telling me, in the same spirit of kindness, that they, being the guardians of letterature, were bound to defend its rights, and to punish every violation thereof, that this, although enormous, yet if done ignorantly, might admit of a pardon, by a humble confession, due repentance, and a promise of reform. The enormity of the offense, the eloquence with which I was addressed, the expressions of kindness, notwithstanding the severity of the censure, and the tender sensibility discovered, lest they should inflict a wound on my feelings, so overwhelmed me at the time that I was deprived of utterance, and compelled to ask time for consideration, which, of their clemency, was granted. It is in this same sense that Matthew, writing as Quails, has deemed Poe, quote, this most brilliant of American poets. There is no question that Matthew was claiming The Raven as his own, despite the fact that he calls it Poe's poem in his travel letter. We know this because while the column is printed in the June 14th edition, he dates his letter from June 2nd, which was Abby's birthday. Matthew has often written secret tributes to Abby, publishing them on, or as close as he could get in a weekly paper, to a significant anniversary date. The date of her death, her funeral, the date he proposed to her, or her birthday. In this case, he has made sure to use the exact day. There is no other explanation, given this habit of Matthew's, than that he is tying Abby directly in with The Raven, and hence claiming that poem as his own tribute to her. There is yet one more mystery attending this letter from Quails. Matthew would often arrange for another of his pieces, or sometimes a piece by another author, to appear immediately before, after, or to the side of his first article. One of these would reinforce the other, as another variation on Matthew's peculiar brand of code. For example, in the October 27, 1849 edition of the Boston Weekly Museum, Matthew published one of Abby's short stories, entitled Nora, 8 years after her death. He had sandwiched it between his own introduction and closing, making of it a letter from one Otis Homer to his niece, but the story itself was Abby's. She had put a great deal of herself into this story. It tells of a girl from an upper-class family which has fallen on hard times, so that she has to live with another family and do sewing for a living. Nora, however, sings and plays the piano beautifully, just as Abby did. Directly below that story, Matthew had caused to be placed Edgar Poe's last poem, Annabel Lee. We don't know whether an editor wrote this heading, or Matthew was bowing to convention by inferring that Poe had written it just before his death, but in actuality, Matthew had originally written it as a tribute to Abby, and Poe, who had had it in his possession since 1842, had for some reason not dared publish it. Another example appears in the August 31, 1850 edition of the museum, where, just above another of Abby's stories entitled Bobby Lincoln, is some other poet's hopeful Christian re-rendering of The Raven, substituting a dove for the raven. Similarly, directly above this Quails letter is a poem written in Matthew's accustomed style, roughly the same style as The Raven, but signed as Robert Johnson. Johnson appears to have been a hack poet who had, on one occasion, plagiarized a piercingly beautiful, somber poem Matthew had once written about the loss of one of his and Abby's children. Johnson had given it the absurdly long biblical title of "Remember how short my time is, wherefore hast thou made all men in vain?" The poem begins, "Now we see the infant sleeping in his wicker cradle bed. Then we find the mother weeping, like a Rachel, for the dead. Time here steals in silent numbers, all that makes up life's brief loan. Since the days of childhood slumbers, who can tell how time has flown?" Johnson did not normally write in this style, and the poem above Quails is definitely Matthew's. It thus appears that he ironically submitted his own poem under this plagiarist name. The poem is an admonition to be forgiving to one's brother, and it clearly refers to the late Edgar Allan Poe. "Deal kindly with thy erring brother. Let not base thoughts thy words control. All anger in that bosom smother, where naught but love should wake the soul." The poem concludes, "Be slow in forming your opinion. You cannot know all men at first. Some gloomy spell may have dominion, and make the better seem the worst. A little word in kindness spoken may sometimes win the hardest heart, and bring back years of friendship broken, and heal what time has caused to smart. Forgive if you would be forgiven. Let kindness here expel all strife. For how can those e'er enter heaven who quarrel on the road of life?" Number 14. Scholars have pointed out that there is one line in a poem entitled Lady Geraldine's Courtship, published in an 1844 compilation by the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which is eerily similar to one of the lines in The Raven. The Raven was published early in 1845, so Barrett's poem appeared first. The relevant line in both poems refers to purple curtains. In Lady Geraldine's Courtship, we read, "With a murmurous stir uncertain, in the air the purple curtain." Whereas in The Raven we see, "and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain." Poe must have been unaware of the similarity, so when he published his compilation, The Raven and Other Poems, he was forced to do damage control with a lavish dedication to Barrett. "To the noblest of her sex, to the author of The Drama of Exile, to Miss Elizabeth Barrett Barrett of England, I dedicate this volume, with the most enthusiastic admiration and with the most sincere esteem." But the two lines are far too similar to be the result of mere admiration. If Poe was influenced at all, they amount to nothing short of plagiarism. However, the answer is that Mathew wrote both of these poems. 1842, the year after Abby's death, was a period in which he appears to have shown or sent his work to various literati, both in America and abroad. These two, Poe and Barrett, apparently saw fit to publish some of it as their own. Poe was simply unaware that Mathew had shared his work with her as well, and that she had also published some of it. Meanwhile, the purple curtain would have simply been a cherished memento of Abby, having belonged to her. Mathew had a habit of reusing elements of his writing that he was particularly pleased with. There are dozens of examples. Because the curtain had a deep sentimental meaning for him, and because he was pleased with the line, and perhaps wished to revise it slightly, he used it in a second poem. He may never have intended, at the time he wrote these poems, to have them published, and so he wasn't concerned about the duplication. Lady Geraldine's Courtship, like The Raven, is near literal autobiography for Mathew. It accurately describes his courtship with Abby, altering only a few facts through literary license. Abby came from French aristocracy, her father being a marquis. She was 15 and 16 when Mathew first began courting her. So in this poem, Mathew has transplanted their courtship to England and given his lover a name which combines two of Abby's favorite girls' names, Juliana and Adeline, and made her into an acceptably older English lady. Mathew, who had been publishing both prose and poetry for several years at that point, remains the aspiring, published poet that one sees in the poem. Mathew often wrote both his prose and his poetry in the context of letters. Lady Geraldine's Courtship is also given in the context of a letter to the poet's friend and fellow student. There are a number of references to Abby as a river sprite in Mathew's work. Apparently, this was his fond nickname for her, perhaps because she liked to swim in the nearby Merrimack River when she was growing up. She also had a fine singing voice and played both harp and piano. She was extremely bright and spiritually advanced beyond her years, as could be demonstrated at length by her own poetry written at age 14. Their relationship appears to have begun with Abby being Mathew's private tutor, despite the fact that she was 4 years younger, and both of them loved to be in the countryside. In Abby's own poem, probably written when she was 14 years old, she writes of singing and dancing in nature. This poem, Sunrise Song, was probably written when she first fell secretly in love with Mathew and would go out into the fields early in the morning. "Forth, forth, fanned by morning's purple wings, pluck the opening flowers. Join the song the springtime sings in its blushing hours. Dance, dance, while the chanting streamlet rings through the rustling bowers." This poem was plagiarized by George W. Light, being published many years later in a compilation which included poetry he had stolen from both Mathew and Abby. However, it stretches credulity that a grown man of the 19th century would be dancing alone among the streamlets and flowers. Hence, it is extremely unlikely to be his own work. In Lady Geraldine's Courtship are seen 4 references to Abby, grouped together in a single stanza. She is portrayed as a godlike child with a fine singing voice and as a river sprite. They have just been reading poetry aloud in nature when they fall silent, and suddenly Lady Geraldine breaks out in song, just as Abby would have done. After, when we were grown tired of books, the silence round us flinging a slow arm of sweet compression, felt with beatings at the breast, she would break out on a sudden in a gush of woodland singing, like a child's emotion in a god, a naiad tired of rest. A naiad is, of course, a river sprite. Number 15. Matthew's first parody of the Raven appeared, as was seen in the first video, in a New York humor magazine called Yankee Doodle in the fall of 1846, signed as E.A. Poe, with the spelling of Poe given as the derogatory term P-O-H. However, there was an earlier parody under this same signature, published in Yankee Doodle in the spring of that year. This one, a caricature of Poe's poetry in general, is called the Haunted Pasty. It lampoons Poe's dark tendency to smear everything spiritual and beautiful by describing the ruination of pastries by vermin. Evil shapes, rats, mice, cockroaches, swarmed upon that pâté's face. Mourn we then, for ne'er our clutches more such pie shall grace. Round about that shelf the glory immense that loomed is a faint, dismembered story, now rat-entombed. Pilgrims now within that larder, through the nibbled pastry see creeping things in foul disorder, feasting gluttonly, while, like hidden Stygian river, its deep chasms o'er, fitful puffs come whiffling ever, sweet no more. But Matthew's typical modus operandi was to secretly encode his real meaning, or his direct message, somewhere in a written piece, and often he would indicate it in the opening quote, or sometimes in what was omitted from the quote by ellipses. In this case, he has rendered it in Latin, the translation of which is a reference to the ancient Roman practice of artificially fattening goose livers. Matthew is comparing Poe's pretensions to poetry with a fattened goose liver, which have been artificially magnified by plagiarism. Directly atop this poem is an anti-war letter in caricature from Thomas P. Smithers, and in style it has any number of indicators of Matthew's authorship. Matthew wrote literally hundreds of these over the years, and in fact it was he who launched this genre in America to begin with. Because Matthew's work, under different pseudonyms and in different genres, often ended up together on the page, we can be certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he was the author of the P.O.H. signed poems as well.